Good evening, everyone. I'm Eisen, the Chancellor of JTS, and I'm happy to welcome you here this evening. This is the point where anyone with a cell phone that is not silent should please take it out and silence it. In a minute, I'm going to be introducing Shai, whose book, Abraham Joshua Heschel, The Call of Transcendence, we're here to celebrate and inquire into this evening. I want to let you know now that at the conclusion of the program, Shai is going to be signing books in the lobby which are for sale out there. We invite you to join him. I want to also issue a couple of thank yous as we start. The first is to Rabbi Eli Confer, Executive Director of Machon Hadar, for his assistance with this event. Machon Hadar is co-sponsoring this evening's program. Several years ago, I had the pleasure of dialoguing with Eli about his book, and we're very happy to get to do that with Shai this evening. I also want to take this opportunity to thank in advance Ms. Amy Meckler for interpreting tonight's program in American Sign Language, and we want to thank the UJA Federation of New York for making that service available this evening. Let me now take a few seconds to introduce Rabbi Shai, a 1999 graduate of JTS's Rabbinical School and Graduate School, who co-founder, dean, and chair of Jewish Thought at Machon Hadar. Before serving in that role, Shai served for 6 years as a scholar in residence at Kehilat Hadar in New York City and taught both theology and halakha at JTS. He has served as director of education at Harvard Hillel, a renowned lecturer and educator. Rabbi Held earned a PhD in religion from Harvard University and is a 2001 recipient of the Covenant Award for Excellence in Jewish Education. He has served in the past on the faculty of both the Wexner Foundation and the Shalom Hartman Institute, and I'm really pleased to say that during this spring semester, Rabbi Held is serving as an adjunct instructor of professional and pastoral skills at JTS and teaching our students Heschel and a whole lot else. Following our dialogue for the next 40 minutes or so, there'll be ample time for audience questions. Please, when the time comes, step up to the microphone and make your questions as succinct as you can, and Shai and I will try to be succinct in answering them. The format is that I'm going to be something in between an interviewer and a full partner to this dialogue. I share private conversations with Shai in which I rejoice. We are friends, and if I might say so, sort of soulmates and theological conversation partners for several years now. We're both looking forward to doing this in public. The spotlight tonight is going to be on Shai, but I'm not simply going to ask him questions. He's going to ask me questions, and we're going to engage in some dialogue about Abraham Joshua Heschel, who is, to both of us, a figure of, let's say, intellectual interest of the first order, but also great personal, transcendent concern. I wouldn't be the person I am without Abraham Joshua Heschel's writings and the one chance I had in my life to meet him in this building in 1971. And Shai, I just wanted to begin there with a sort of personal, as it were, question to you about this and about the book. So you chose Heschel as a dissertation topic. Out of all the things you could have written about, you chose to write about Abraham Joshua Heschel, and you chose to write about a particular set of topics in Abraham Joshua Heschel. How did he grab you, and why did he grab you for this particular purpose?
Okay. First of all, thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you, Arnie, for this conversation and many others. I will say that it is a special privilege for me to talk about this book in this place for two totally separate reasons. One, this being a place where Heschel spent many decades of his life, but two, there are many people in this institution, friends, colleagues, students, teachers, who have believed in this project during its many, many, many years of gestation. And I feel a profound debt to a lot of people in this institution and in this room, so thank you. When I think about why I wrote this book, sometimes I think that question is two questions. Why I wrote this book and why I wrote this book. And I actually think that on some level they're different questions. The reason I wrote this book, the way that I've been thinking about this a lot lately is that I had a moment when I was a freshman in college. I was sitting in a seminar on Maimonides taught by the late Professor Isidore Tversky, my first academic Jewish studies professor, who was a very stern man and did not share much about himself, to say the least. And yet, late in the semester, all of a sudden, in this moment of utter candor, he said, "You have to understand, the Rambam has been my life's companion." And it was such a disarming moment. I always like to say, when I was 19, I had no idea what he was talking about. I was thinking about life companions. They were not the Rambam. And in fact, I felt like it was a waste of time. I should be out looking for a life companion. 17 years later, I found one. But 15 years later, I had a moment in which that moment came back to me. And I realized I know exactly what he's talking about because Heschel has been that in my life. I have been inspired, provoked, infuriated, motivated, disappointed by my relationship with this person, this thinker, this writer, in ways that are, hard to describe, more so than any other human being who has ever written anything, which is quite a statement. And on some level, at the risk of descending into psychobabble, I wrote this book so that he and I could work this out, so that I could figure out on some level, first of all, what he was really saying, and second of all, what of those things that he was saying I thought remained compelling and maybe even personally meaningful. But the truth is, there's another piece of it, which is, at the end of the day, I'm not really that interested in the more obscure side of academic projects. And I knew very well going in that I could only actually finish this project if I wrote about someone who, even after a day where I had been poking holes in everything he said, at the end of the day, I would know that I was writing about someone who was a giant. That was sort of very important to me. I wanted to write about someone who made me feel small. I often remember a moment, another Jewish academic moment, where Professor Avi Ravitsky of the Hebrew University said to me in this moment of it was so moving, very out of character for him also. He said, I'll say this in Hebrew and then translate it, just sort of in a conversation, Ani mamash lo kukist, right? I am not a student of Rav Kook, not by a long shot. Aval ilu Rav Kook haya achshav nichnas lacheder, hayiti mitchabe mitachat lashulchan merov yir'ah, right? Right? But if Rav Kook walked into the room right now, I would dive under the nearest table out of sheer awe. And I never stopped feeling that way about Heschel, and it's the only reason I could ever have written this book, let alone finished it.
And as a result, if I could say this, you wrote a book that is a very generous book. In other words, you're not uncritical. We talked about this, and I counted up the times when Shai offers serious critiques of Heschel. I think there are about a dozen such occasions in the book. But over and over again, you go out of your way to be generous to the man. You're not here to poke holes. You're not here to score points. You're here to really understand him. And you're here to really understand him because you think he's of more than academic interest. He's of great personal interest to you, and you think he should be of great personal interest to your readers, if I'm right.
Right. On a certain level, I wrote this book, so that question about why I wrote this book as opposed to why I wrote it, right? People talk all the time about the ways that Heschel has gone very far on his eloquence, right? On his just unbelievable ability to turn a sentence in his fourth language learned in his late 20s, right? Which is just mind-boggling to think about. But the truth is, in many ways, Heschel has also been the victim of his own eloquence in really profound ways because it has allowed all kinds of people to say about Heschel, he is merely a poet. Mm-hmm. Now, I think Heschel would be quick to say, anyone who's willing to apply the adverb merely to poet is actually admitting their own impoverishment. Mm-hmm. But he is also not only a poet. And in fact, one of the things I try to argue in the book, which we can maybe talk about later, is I think in many ways he's a poet precisely because of his philosophical and theological project. Now, about being generous, it's sort of striking the ways in which Heschel largely is the recipient either of derision or of worship. In the context of academic Jewish studies, Jewish philosophy, Heschel is often sort of written off as not a serious figure. I remember giving a lecture about Heschel at an Ivy League school not so long ago, Ivy League University, in which a professor came up to me afterwards and said, "Why can't you just admit that Heschel was a public intellectual?" Which was not a compliment, right? So that tendency, and then on the other hand, the Heschel was, a demigod. And on some level, I really wanted to treat him with more respect than either the derision or the worship gives him, right? to actually take him seriously as what he wanted to be. A philosopher of religion and theologian, an interpreter of the Jewish tradition, and a modern critic of modernity. All of those roles were very important to him, and I think he has enormously important things to say. And I wanted to respect him more than either writing him off or bowing down to him, I mean that crudely, but to really engage him in a philosophical conversation.
Yeah, you and I share this predilection that you don't do a great thinker any favor by just passing by their faults. I mean, that's not what we're here to do. That you have to believe that we make them stronger, as it were. We make them better appreciated by seeing the things that don't quite hold water, and therefore you have much more credibility in standing up for all those things that really stand. I mean, he's a much greater thinker than a mere public intellectual or poet. But don't you think, you alluded to this point, so why don't we pick this up right now, that he wrote a kind of prose poem. He wrote a kind of lyrical set of pieces because he thought there's a part of the self that needs to be awakened that rational philosophy is not going to get to. So his method completely suited his feeling. He believed there's some other faculty in us aside from cognition. There's something in us that's even deeper, you might say, for that metaphor, than reason alone, and he's got to help us get to it, and he can't awaken it through logical argument. He's got to touch it somehow through poetry, right? And so he's got to call us, to do the segue here, he's got to call us to self-transcendence. He's got to get us out of our usual boundaries. He's got to take us past our comfort zone, right?
Yeah, so I think that I would say this in the following way. You know, it's funny, there's a phrase in Heschel that I have to admit did not really register to me when I wrote the book. I've only been thinking about it since, which is one of his definitions of wonder is a sense of unmitigated innate surprise. And it's only recently that I have come to really understand how important the word innate is in that phrase. Because what that means is that his job as a religious writer is not to give us something that we do not already have, but rather to tear the calluses off so that what is already there inside becomes available to us again. And that's one of the reasons that poetry is so important to him, because at the end of the day, if any of you have ever studied academic philosophy, it is very rare that at step 37A of an analytic philosophy essay, all of a sudden you think, my heart is open to the transcendent, right? It's not what happens. Right. And on some level, I think he thinks that the poetic mode is what he needs in order to fight what modernity has done, right? Modern people in all kinds of ways have been closed off to the possibility of the transcendent. We can call that different things, a disenchanted world, an immanent frame, all these different terms that get bandied about. And if Heschel wants to open us to the possibility of the transcendent, that is also cognitive, but it is not merely cognitive, and maybe is not even primarily cognitive. Right. It is about opening our being, not just opening our minds. And that's not done by a 13-step argument, right? So the poetry is really in service of an analysis of what is needed, right? And that is on some level to tear open a certain kind of shutdownness that is part of the modern condition.
And the weakness of it is either, as you say at some point, you either get it or you don't, and Heschel kind of assumes that you're going to get it because he's got it, or you should get it because we all have it. And there's that well-known passage at the end of chapter 9 of Man is Not Alone where he said, kind of, you should be ashamed, right? If your heart doesn't, you remember the exact quote, I don't have it in front of me, but you should pray for a feeling of shame, right? If you've been awakened, then you turn away from it, right? He holds you somehow responsible for this.
Right. So I would say two things about this. One is, on one level, it's a very generous move for a religious thinker to assume that at bottom, if you peel enough layers away, everyone has a kind of attachment to God. It may be an unavoidable claim for a religious maker to make on some level. The problem, philosophically, is when you build a worldview that is so rooted in intuition, you have a very hard time dealing with people who insist to you up and down that their primary intuitions are different. And I think some of the weakest points in Heschel's writing are when he insists, if you dig deeper, you'll find you have my intuition. I think he does that over and over again. However, I want to say one other thing about this, which is those moments when he attacks non-believers. It took me a while to actually sort of get this. But I realized at a certain point that one should distinguish between what a thinker does in a rhetorical mode and what they might say over coffee at Starbucks. Meaning, it is very hard for me to believe that a thinker who talks about a blackout of God in the modern world would actually say in a discursive mode, talking one-on-one, right, any lack of belief is on some level a character failure. There's no such thing as non-culpable non-belief, right? It is a rhetorical move, and so the question becomes, why does someone say that? And I think one of the things he's trying to do is to jolt the reader who on some level shares in his understanding of modernity irreducibly secular assumptions, unshakably secularist assumptions. What he wants to do with those sentences, I think, are actually grab you and shake you. And I think, one of the things I try to do in the book, when I sort of began to understand this, is I went off and started reading all kinds of literary theory on the use of hyperbole. Because I was trying to understand, what is he doing? And one of the things that I found really interesting is that theorists of hyperbole all say, hyperbole works when someone shares at least some of your assumption. But it seems ridiculous when they have no idea what you're saying. And I think it's an interesting way to think about the passages in Heschel that work for some people. Some people would say, yeah, those passages shook me out of my slumber, right? And other people are like, famously Arthur Cohen, these are just offensive passages, right? They just simply don't take unbelief seriously and all the reasons for it. And that's when I think the hyperbole reaches too far for many people. But I don't think we should read Heschel as simply saying, right, there's no such, every unbelief is a character failure. I'm not sure he would actually argue that as a sort of discursive claim as opposed to a listen reader, right? Listen reader who lives in, an iron cage that is completely closed off to any incursion of anything greater than it. I will rattle this cage. That's what he's trying to do.
Right. So let's focus in a little bit on the topic, which you make your theme, the self transcendence, and Heschel is trying to save us in a certain way. I mean, he really believes that we are trapped, as you said. Ourselves are stunted. We are focused on things that are false. We are missing an immense amount of possibility which is open to us, which is in us, which is standing before us, and we just can't get it. We don't even know, we don't even want it because we don't know about it. And he's challenging some really fundamental things about the modern self, right? So he's got to shake us up because he thinks that we are more trapped than any previous culture was. Like, it's almost better to have idolatry and have lots of gods because at least there are gods. And he would almost say, so our God is ourselves. Our God is the self. And unless we transcend this and get beyond the self, we miss it, right? We just miss it. We not quite live in vain. That would be too strong. But we miss something we should be living for and with.
Yeah, I think there's maybe a couple ways to come at the point you're making. One is that one of the most important dichotomies in Heschel's thought is between what he calls the way of wonder on the one hand and the way of expediency on the other. And it took me a while to understand what the way of expediency was, because it's one of those words. I sort of think every person has a bunch of words that they use that at a certain moment in their life they realize they actually have no idea what the word means, right? No, I mean that quite seriously, right? And expediency was one of those words for me. I kept reading Heschel saying, the problem with modernity is that people are all focused on expediency. And at a certain point I realized I have no idea what that means. And, beyond looking at dictionaries, I started trying to reread every passage in Heschel where he talks about expediency, and I realized that on some level, you could see that as one of the interpretive keys of his whole project. Because expediency is Heschel's way of talking about a life in which the only question that orients my life is the question of how can I use this? Right? What we might call the instrumentalization of the world. Everything is about how can this serve my own ends, right? So everything, including crucially religion and God, right? And you can think about the discourse of American spirituality. How can religion serve you, right? Or the discourse of American yoga practice, which many traditional yogis would be sort of appalled by. Give yourself a gift, right? The discourse of the Lululemonization of yoga, right? What that means. Where everything becomes a tool, right? Ultimately, people, right, also become tools. Everything is for my own purpose. The way of wonder, in contrast, is about essentially the realization that I did not create the world or myself, and that being the most primal awareness there is. And the moment I realize that the world is a gift, my life is a gift, my life in the world is a gift within a gift. That's my formulation, not Heschel's, but I think he would endorse that, when you actually come alive to that as a foundational, formative awareness, all of a sudden your question becomes, I owe something. How can I serve? And the reorientation that Heschel is interested in, the move from the culture of expediency, the culture of wonder, is moving from how can I use this to how can I serve? That is what makes possible the project of self-transcendence. Now, self-transcendence is a term which basically, as far as I can tell, every philosopher and every psychologist who uses this term uses it somewhat differently, which makes it very elusive. And if I were to try to define for Heschel, at least I don't think these are the only ways to define it, but two maybe just very short, useful ways of thinking about what this means in Heschel. One is, very simply, self-transcendence consists of, may even simply be equal to, the project of what he calls transitive concern. And transitive concern is really just a fancy way of saying caring about selves other than me, right? Where actually the well-being of other things and other beings than me is truly fundamental and matters to me in profound ways. That's the opposite. Another famous Heschelian dichotomy, reflexive concern is the focus on me. Transitive concern is the care about you. And as he famously puts it, you cannot be an organic being who is alive without reflexive concern. And yet, you cannot be fully human without the project of cultivating transitive concern, where selves other than you really matter to you. And the fundamental question in encountering them is, how can I use you? How can you help me? That's one way of thinking about the definition. Another, which I think is very useful, is the attempt to overcome the illusion that my ego and my consciousness are the center of the universe. And I want to say this is, in my own language, not his. I don't think he would talk this way. But I think it's important to acknowledge how hard that is, because all of us have a consciousness that presents itself that way. What do you mean my consciousness is not the center of the universe? I perceive everything through the center of the universe, which is my consciousness, right? And on some level, all religious traditions are engaged. I don't mean to relativize them. I don't think they're all the same. But all religious traditions are on some level attempts to overcome the illusion that that perception is somehow a metaphysical truth, right? In fact, my consciousness is no more the center of the universe than yours is, or yours is, or yours is. And in fact, for Heschel, God's is the center of the universe. And the realization, in other words, that the consciousness around which the world rotates is the divine consciousness and not my own. That's already like the conversation of what self-transcendence could be.
Yeah, Heschel is onto something deep here about modernity, I think. I spent several years of my own graduate school life immersed in the thinking of the great German sociologist and social theorist Max Weber. And for Max Weber, who wrote The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism and was the great analyst of the relationship between science and religion and Western bureaucracy, the key concept in Max Weber is rationality. Right. And Max Weber's understanding of rationality is precisely what you're calling expediency, that I am constantly calculating what he called life chances. I decide what my goal is. There's no scientific way to establish what a good goal is as opposed to a less good goal. We choose our goals for all sorts of reasons, and then we spend our lives calculating what the most advantageous ways of pursuing this goal is. Individuals do this, societies do it, so the self is really the center of the calculation, and that's what rationality is about. And Heschel is saying, you're going to, in a sense, waste your life if that's your only focus, because the world is not about you. So the step number one to being an ethical person, I think he would even put it that way, right? Step number one to being an ethical person is to get beyond yourself and transcend yourself and not act as if you're seeking your own advantage is what life is for, right?
Right. I mean, this would not be his primary argument, but he does essentially say, especially at the end of God in Search of Man, that in addition to being immoral, this way of living is actually self-defeating. Right?
Because you can't get what you want?
Because people who spend their entire life focused on finding their own happiness almost never find it. That on some level, happiness depends on a form of self-forgetfulness. Right. When you actually serve something that isn't you. That on some level, that is the meaning of life. Right? Can you serve something that is not you? There are secular versions of this argument, meaning for Heschel, obviously, it's very closely tied to God. But on some level, do we serve ends that are greater than our own? Do we serve ends that are greater than us? That is actually the only path to genuine happiness or joy. And also, and I think this is actually one of the most interesting things Heschel says, and he says it really as a throwaway comment. He says that on some level, again, this is my formulation, not his, the illusion that spontaneity is the same thing as freedom, right? That freedom equals my ability to do what I want and no one can tell me what I should do, as opposed to the freedom not to merely be enslaved to my own impulses, but to respond to things, to people, to a God other than me, right? That's the only possibility of freedom. So what I'm suggesting is, it's true, it's the only way to live. Self-transcendence is necessary for ethics, for religion, but in an interesting way, it's also necessary for the very things that people who don't pursue it think they want, namely happiness and freedom.
So one of the interesting moves he makes, and now we're going to do a segue here to talk about God a little bit. One of the interesting moves he makes is that God also self-transcends, right? And because God self-transcends, God seeks out human partners. And because God seeks out human partners, God needs us. That is, Heschel says all this self-transcendence, but he's against the obliteration of the self. He's against the annihilation of the self. He's not calling for selflessness. He needs strong human beings, right? God needs strong human beings to work in the world, and it's like it's forbidden for us to turn our backs on the world in the search for pure self-transcendence, as it were. So you need a certain amount of self, and you certainly need to be in the world to fulfill the purposes which the self-transcending God directs you to, right? So talk for a little bit about this really difficult matter of Heschel's notions of God.
Right, it's interesting because it's hard to even ask the question, because I could imagine Heschel thundering and saying, I don't have a notion of God, right? But I have, right? But rather I have the reality of God before me. A notion of God is for philosophers, right? Or in the language of phenomenology, I have an understanding of God. He famously, gives this talk where he says, I was invited to give a paper to a bunch of Christian theologians, and I talked about, the paper topic was the God of Israel. And I forget exactly what he says, and they changed it to the idea of God in the writings of Israel. He's like, I don't have an idea of God. That's for a certain kind of philosopher. That's not what I do, right? An idea of God, you don't ever bow down and worship an idea, right? It's an attack on Hermann Cohen, I think. Yeah. You don't bow down to an idea. Right. So, maybe we'd say it this way. One of the central projects of Heschel's life was to show that, as great a figure as he was, Maimonides did unspeakable damage to the authenticity of Jewish belief, right? This is one of the central projects of Heschel's life. And I'll explain that maybe in the following way, because he says something very provocative, actually, at the beginning of God in Search of Man, which no one ever pays attention to because they want to get to the part about wonder. So the first two chapters kind of fall away. But he says this really fascinating thing. He says, all these people in the Middle Ages who claim to have achieved synthesis between revelation and philosophy, at the end of the day, what they achieved was surrender, not synthesis. Because by the time they were done, lo and behold, the God of the Bible was the God of Aristotle. That's not a synthesis, that's a capitulation. So in the end, what does Maimonides worship, right? I'm using this word in a loaded way intentionally, a self-involved creator who doesn't notice or have relationship with anything he has created. Heschel says that's the God of the Bible, right? Now we obviously can't do a seminar on Maimonides here, but if it's true, which I think it is if you read book 1 of The God of the Perplexed, that you can't say God cares, and you can't say God loves, and you can't say God enters into relation, right? You can read The God of the Perplexed and count the number of times Maimonides uses the word covenant. If I'm not mistaken, you'll have 4 fingers left over on your first hand. It's amazing, right? If you can't say any of those things, in what way are you talking about the God of Israel? And that argument for Heschel essentially depends on the following distinction, right? The God of Maimonides is all reflexive concern, right? The God of Maimonides is off contemplating God's self for all eternity, right? I'm actually going to say it this way. This is my own formulation, but I think this is actually a useful way of thinking about this. In contrast, human beings are a kind of admixture of transitive and reflexive concern, right? We have reflexive concern, necessarily. In our better moments, we have transitive concern. In our few really wonderful moments, we have expansive transitive concern. The God of Israel, Heschel argues, I am not defending this as a great reading of Tanakh, but the God of Israel is all transitive concern. God has no care for God's self. If we went around the room, we could point to passages in Tanakh that seems less persuasive, right? Heschel might have been better off to say the God of Tanakh is mostly transitive concern, right? But Heschel's understanding of the God of Tanakh is, right, what does God really care about? Widows and orphans. One of my favorite lines in Heschel is this passing comment, I'm going to get it a little bit wrong, in Man Is Not Alone, where he says, it's just such an amazing line, Zeus loves women, but God loves widows. It's so powerful, actually. It's a great, right? Say that in your fourth language, right? But here's the thing, in other words, if the God of Maimonides is all reflexive concern, and human beings are reflexive and transitive concern mixed together in this kind of constantly jostling way, and the God of the Bible is all transitive concern, then the God of Maimonides is less than a human being and not more. That is Heschel's assault on the Rambam, right? You know what's different between me and the Rambam's God? Sometimes I care about widows. Rambam's God never cares about widows or anything else. So the argument is, right, I have to rescue the authentic God of the Bible and put that again at the center of Jewish philosophy. Now, that matters because Heschel really cares about metaphysical truth, right? But it also matters for another reason. It took me a while to sort of understand this about him. I think that he is animated by a very passionate assumption that the God you worship cannot but impact how you imagine an ideal human life looks. And so if you worship a God who is totally indifferent, on some level, you will come to valorize, to celebrate what he derisively calls homo apathetikos, right? The human being who is unmoved. I find it interesting. I think it's a bad reading of the Rambam, but I find it interesting, and Heschel would, I think, find this interesting support, that a contemporary scholar of the Rambam, fairly well known, writes an essay in which he says, yes, the Rambam's human ideal is a person who is completely devoid of emotion. By the way, he's wrong, but that doesn't matter, right? I think Heschel's point is, if that is a hava amina, if that is a thought you could have about what Judaism wants, your theology is off the deep end, right? And in contrast, right, if you worship a God who loves widows and orphans, and I want to underline here, worship a God, not go to shul, not just, go through, but if you worship a God, would that any of us a few moments in our life actually do that? If you worship a God who loves widows and orphans, then on some level, you cannot but work on the project of loving widows and orphans, right? Because on some level, what theology becomes is God saying back to you, you want to love me? Love who I love. By the way, at the risk of actually saying this in front of actual Bible scholars, I think that's also the logic of Deuteronomy 10. Deuteronomy 10:18, God loves the stranger. Deuteronomy 10:19, you should love the stranger. It's a form of imitatio Dei, right? Of the imitation of God. God loves the vulnerable. That's your project too. That's what it means to talk about God for him.
How can Heschel be so sure that he's right about this?
Right. Well, how can Heschel be so sure of a lot of things? Right. I think, well, here's what I would say about this for what it's worth, and then we could, spend the rest of our life having angst about it. I think it is unquestionably the case that Heschel is right about the God of the canonical Jewish tradition. I think the interesting question is whether the God he's talking about is metaphysically believable in this day and age. Right? To me, the question is not whether he's a better reader of Tanakh than the Rambam. I would say here, Pshita, of course he's a better reader of the canon than the Rambam. And he's right, the Rambam does violence to the canon. Of course that's true. The question is, right, what does it mean to say that in a world of such unimaginable suffering that is so pervasive and unabated? What does it mean, right? And that's the deep question. That's where I think the challenge really comes. But that he's right to understand himself as defending the tradition. That I think is obviously right. By the way, another way of putting this, if this is useful as a frame, this is also something I don't remember if this is in the book actually. If you had asked Maimonides, what is the enemy that you're fighting against? Without a question, Maimonides would have said idolatry. And it's worth saying, Maimonides would have said, I know you think I'm attacking Moses, but I'm not. Moses spent his life destroying all of the external pictures of God that the Israelites had. I am destroying all the internal pictures they had, right? I am the second Moshe. I'm fulfilling the Mosaic project. That's what I'm doing. right? I am stamping out the idols. Why is it so much better to say, we'd never have an idol, but I'm going to picture a big old guy and daven to him? Why is that so much better? So I want to do away with that too, right? So he didn't think he was assaulting Moses. And yet, right, what's left is very little. Now, if you had asked Heschel, what is the enemy that you're struggling with? Without question, Heschel would have said, the enemy is indifference. The enemy is that we live in a time in which we have internalized so profoundly that at the end of the day, human beings, bigadol, writ large, are, to use a favorite phrase of his, callous to catastrophes. We don't care, right? What line should fill us with bitter irony more than never again? What the hell are we talking about? Come on. What do you mean to go on saying that? So he says, if the problem is indifference, how can you actually then worship a God whose fundamental attribute is indifference? That God will never help you overcome indifference.
But how do you make credible the God that he's telling us to worship?
Right. So
it's a God who gets angry. This is a God who's supposed to be there, who's not there. So what are you going to do with this God?
Well, so, by the way, the anger piece is fascinating. One of the, I think, most interesting things that Heschel says in the Prophets that is usually kind of ignored is that people often dismiss or are derisive of the Bible because, so they say, the God of the Old Testament is angry. And Heschel says, for those of us who lived through what we lived through, I am extraordinarily grateful and religiously uplifted by the fact that there is a God who gets angry. Because it means that somewhere in the universe, the murder of children matters. Human history shows no evidence that that actually makes a difference. But if you believe in Revelation, well, that's the core claim. Now, how do you make it credible? I think that Heschel had a project. Now, I understand he can lose people at every step of the way. The project is the following. If I can convince you that, to quote from St. Augustine, I did not create myself, and therefore I owe something. That question, probably the sentence that Heschel writes more than any other over the course of his career, is the sentence, something is asked of us. If I can convince you, or better, to go back to where we started, elicit in you the sense that something is asked of us, that is the portal in human experience to the possibility of revelation being interesting to you. Because if you have this sense as a human being of, what do I owe? What is asked of me and by whom? What is asked of me and by whom? Then all of a sudden, the Bible matters. The clue to this, as Heschel famously says, right? The Bible is an answer, but the question has gone out of the world. So the project of the first part of God in Search of Man is to rediscover the question, to which the Bible is an answer. Ma Hashem Elohecha shoel mi'imach, right? What does the Lord your God ask of you? Now, there are a lot of steps here which we could take apart where you're going to lose some people at each step you take. But I don't think he thinks he can make the God of the Bible credible without first awakening a kind of dormant spiritual hunger that says, oh, how can I serve? Or in a great formulation of his, what we own, we owe. Right? That realization of what we own, we owe. The sense, say that in Jewish language, the sense of chiyuv, an existential sense of obligation. Right? That's the window. That's the portal.
And he bet correctly on where the culture was going. In other words, this is a time for existentialism, and the Bible, put it this way, is a very existentialist book. The Bible gives us human beings as they are. They're not in a realm of perfection. They're in a realm of great inadequacy. They express doubt all the time. A book of the Bible that has Psalm 44 is an amazing religious document, and therefore is credible to us in a way it wouldn't have been if it was a book speaking about perfections and omniscience and omnipotence and all that sort of thing. So Heschel had the right language, I think, for the time. He bet correctly. His intuitions were right. And there's a piece here I just want to highlight. He wants to empower us to be interpreters. In other words, he knows that he has to save the Bible from false readings to which the Bible itself is prone. The Bible itself allows you to tear the Bible apart. And he famously proclaims that Judaism is a religion with a minimum of revelation and a maximum of interpretation, right? He depends on that maximum of interpretation to save the Bible from its own faults, or to prevent people from doing cheap shots, or and not just there's terrible stuff there. And he has to enable us to save the Bible, as it were, to make the Bible a living document for people by using the Bible to critique the passages in the Bible which don't work, right? And so he's got to empower us in that way, and he believes he's there.
So I think one of the most rhetorically genius, it's not English, a moment of utter rhetorical genius in Heschel is this one sentence in the 27th chapter of God in Search of Man, where he says, when we critique the Bible for its what he calls harsh passages, we should always remember that the conscience that leads us to critique it was itself shaped by the Bible. And what I think he's doing there is genius because it does two things at once. At one and the same time, it defends the Bible against its attackers and empowers those who want to read it resistantly at certain moments by saying you are reading with the conscience that the Bible itself instilled in you, right? So it disarms a certain mode of criticism and empowers a certain mode of activist religious reading, right? It's a totally brilliant kind of rhetorical, in one sentence, right? Once you remember that, now it's easy to say, oh, the Bible shaped your conscience, so shut up. Or, oh, the Bible is horrible. You can choose one pole. But he specifically wants to do the opposite. To say, oh, you're offended by this passage? That's because the Bible was the first document in the history of the world that made a radical claim about human equality. Right? So you are critiquing the Bible from a perspective that the Bible itself makes possible. And here, I think he's, theoretically very radical. That is to say, I think he really makes the possibility, he makes real the possibility of a kind of rebellious reading of Scripture that is, when done in a certain frame of mind, not a form of rebellion, but a deeper form of fidelity.
And he makes that possible, but he won't take advantage of it himself.
Well, I think someone will one day write a book about why some of the most interesting 20th century Jewish thinkers who cared about halakha never wrote tshuva. Right? Someone will one day write an interesting article, why Yitzhak Greenberg and David Hartman never wrote a tshuva in their life. Right? Why not paskin? Why not decide halachically the orthodoxy that you want? Heschel was not that. And he does not give us an essay in sort of a projected halachic hermeneutic. Here's how you should read. But I think he is trying very hard to speak to people who determine Jewish law, not just them, but also them, saying, what are the values that should animate you? Right? What is the project that you're doing? And I would say, this goes without saying, I hope, it is anti-formalistic in the extreme, right? It is not about just interpreting a set of rules within an internal system, right?
It's got ethical ends to serve.
Ethical, theological ends. It's about a constant attempt to instantiate certain values in the world through law.
That's right. But doesn't this go along with his refusal? Let's not say absolute refusal, but he's very reluctant to express doubt.
Right, so this...
He opens the door for you to doubt. There's a whole chapter of Man is Not Alone, chapter 10, right after the climactic page about an experience of God. The next chapter, turn the page, it's called Doubt. But Heschel rarely steps through that door. He won't do it.
Right. I think one of the things, I'll tell you, just speak very personally, when I was first reading Heschel, I found this enormously moving. And as I've gotten older, I find it at once moving and disappointing. And that is essentially that Heschel treats all moments of metaphysical doubt as relational rupture. Meaning any time you begin to doubt the reality of God, pray. That, by the way, I think that's actually, I don't know if this was conscious, that's actually the fundamental strategy, for example, of Rabbi Nachman and Likutei Moharan. Every time you begin to wonder, daven, right? That's, so
shout down the doubt.
I don't know if it's shouted down. I think it's actually shouted to God. So here's one of the most amazing things I discovered about Heschel's corpus, and this was just, after reading it over and over again, I realized every time he begins to talk about questions about God, every last time until the last book, every last time, he immediately shifts to the second person, and in the middle of a book of philosophy, begins to speak to God. It's amazing, right? It's what I would call sort of liturgical preemption of philosophy. Right? I'm not going to do that now. That's a dead end for me. So I'm going to pray. Now the problem is it takes a tremendous leap in all those moments to believe that prayer is the answer, right? As opposed to actually wondering whether all this is plausible. One of the things I tried to argue in the book, this is sort of one of the sort of revisionist arguments I make, people often say that Heschel's approach to the Shoah is to believe that at the end of the day he has solved the problem of the Shoah by talking about how radical the freedom that God gives us is.
It's a mistake.
I think that that's totally wrong, because, as I just mentioned, there are all these moments where he begins to do a theodicy, and then the second-person question of God begins. The most amazing moment of that is chapter 16 of Man is Not Alone, which is fascinating, right? It begins with an answer. Here is why the world has been allowed to run amok. God allows us radical freedom. We blame God even though we are the ones who have done it wrong. And then, almost entirely without transition, he stops and presents Psalm 44 as a whole.
In full, yeah.
In full, end of chapter. Mm-hmm. What is Psalm 44? The most wild text in Tanakh. What the great Protestant Bible scholar, parenthesis, and no lover of the Jews, Franz Delitzsch, called the national version of the book of Job. Psalm 44. Ura lama tishan Adonai. Wake up, God, why are you sleeping? Mm-hmm. Right? Now, if Heschel really thought he had solved the problem of the Shoah, he would begin by asking, Ura lama tishan Adonai, lama taster panecha, why are you hiding your face? And then give you the answers. But instead what he does is give you the answer and then scream the question. And everyone misses that about him. Now again, that's not saying, it's interesting, he won't say it in his own words. But that's a moment of, you know what, God? I can talk about a thrust, a general direction of how to understand why the world is allowed to be the abyss that it so often is. But I don't for one second think I've gotten you off the hook. Right? I recently realized that there's a sentence where he says this very powerfully. And I somehow missed this in the writing of the book. He says something like, we are responsible for our actions, but God is responsible for our freedom. It's a very profound sentence, right? In other words, God is the one who created us with the capacity for, right, the capacity for unimagined brutality. And on some level, what we do is a reflection on the one who gave it. The free will defense is ultimately not a defense, right? It may be the direction of a defense, but it, as I like to say, it inculpates God. It doesn't exculpate God, right? God gets pulled in. And so I think there is that in Heschel. Now, would some readers be able to connect to Heschel more if he said a sentence like, some nights I wake up in the middle of the night and think that being a theist has got to be the biggest delusion in the whole universe? Probably. But he also, as you have written about, assumed a certain persona. I actually think that at a certain moment of history, that was one of Heschel's forms of self-transcendence. He thought, you know what? The Jewish people have more than enough people who can articulate their doubt. I'm going to defend the God of Israel. I'm going to try to make the God of Israel plausible in a world where people think it's absurd, or worse yet, if you're interested in academic philosophy, in a time when people think it's not even absurd, it's nonsense, right? It doesn't make any sense to even talk about that. So on some level, I think Heschel muted some of his own doubt, partially in service of what he thought his job was in that moment.
So that's the good segue for me to ask the final question I want to talk about with you for a few minutes before we throw the floor open to the audience. So you write very convincingly, I think, that Heschel, when he wrote about Sajja's quest for certainty, was in a sense writing about Heschel's quest for certainty. And when Heschel wrote about whether Rambam believed that Rambam was a prophet, we wonder the consciousness of Heschel about the degree to which Heschel understood himself to be a sort of prophet. So I want to ask you about Shai Held writing a book about Heschel. How much of this is Shai, this book? And what are you doing in this book to teach Shai, as it were? How much of this is Shai figuring out Shai Held as a religious thinker?
Well, I would say to the extent that I was trying to figure myself out as a religious thinker, the project failed. I'm
not sure about that.
But, yeah. I mean, I was, on some level, I was doing that. I mean, it goes back to what I said earlier about, my understanding of Professor Tversky's comment. I felt in writing this book that I was trying to figure out what seemed to me to be philosophically and theologically plausible in Heschel's corpus, what I could actually embrace. On some level, when I wrote this book, he and I were alone in a room having it out. And I meant that, quite seriously. That's what I was doing. It is also the case, without being sort of impossibly reductive about this, the way some people are, especially on the academic left, people on some level end up discovering the questions that matter most to them. And, I'm totally open to the observation that my insistence that the fundamental question in Heschel is about self-transcendence is my own project. I think it's very much there. But, as I've thought about what it means to be a religious teacher in our world and what it actually means in a culture that is so obsessed with self. I recently gave a lecture in which afterwards a Haredi rabbi from Brooklyn who was there said something to me that was so moving to me. Some of you heard me quote this before because I talk about it all the time now. He came up to me and he said, "Do you think it's a coincidence that all the most desirable items in our culture are things like an iPad, an iPod, an I this, an I that? You think that that's just random?
It's not.
You don't think that's a confession about what this culture has become?"
It's a result
of
of market. It's market research. Come on,
right?
not
Exactly. So one of the things I tell students all the time, and by the way, and to me on some level, about this, I don't care whether they think they're the firmest of the firm or the most secular or the secular, right? The project of, can you actually have moments when you realize that I am not the center of the universe? If you do not have those moments, you have never participated in authentic religion. I don't care whether you spend your whole life learning Torah.
It's hard to be in a relationship for very long if you don't have those moments,
That's exactly right. No, that's exactly right. I mean, by the way, a relationship with God and a relationship with humanity, with human beings, is enabled by exactly the same thing, right? Which is actually like another form of thinking about self-transcendence for Heschel is the project of making space. That's what God does. God makes space, for the
others.
Dignity and the what philosophers call the meaningful freedom of human life, right? And what it means to be in a relationship on some level is to do just that. So I think that's right. Now, and I know I didn't fully answer your question, to be sure, but on some level, I feel a little bit that I have the same version of the struggle that he had. In certain settings, academic settings, I'm willing to talk about, yes, there's this philosophical problem, there's that philosophical problem in Heschel, right? There are really, I think, major philosophical holes, and yet the fundamental project of a reorientation of human culture I find to be so powerfully expressed, more powerfully articulated by Heschel than by almost anyone else in the 20th century. I don't think it's unique to him. I think, it's a different conversation. An awful lot of what's in Heschel is in Buber in kind of seed form. But that project, to me, at the end of the day, that's what I do, Right? Can we reorient such that the reality of the other makes a claim upon me? Because if I worship God, that God tells me that's what matters.
See, I don't know about you, but for me, what gave Heschel credibility in saying all this was, in one sentence, that march in Selma, Alabama. In other words, we hear a lot of religious thinkers saying a lot of religious things and a lot of wonderful things, a lot of beautiful things, and they're talking about transcending ourselves. But the fact that the man understood there was a historical moment where he had to put his life on the line as the great representative Jewish thinker he was, and iconic, right, with the white beard and the kippah. And for our generation, he put his life on the line there as a religious Jew. That, for me, when I was 16 years old, that's what enabled me to take Heschel seriously as a religious thinker and forced me to take Heschel seriously as a religious thinker. And at times I was mad at him because he seemed to be lowering himself through politics. Like anybody could do politics. Why is a great religious thinker doing politics? But then I recognized that he understood this is what God wants. If you're not out there doing it, what's the point, right? So that, in turn, purchased credibility in my eyes for everything else he had to teach me. He got my attention, as it were. And then, so he understood there's something personally for me in my life, but there's a historical moment that's calling to us. And I just want to end this with this one. You put the word call in the title, not coincidentally. It's a key word here. Heschel believes that God is calling to us, history is calling to us, he's calling to us. And in a sense, you become a transmitter of this call by writing this book, right? You're calling to us. And we kind of put ourselves on the line. We better answer the call. If we're going to call other people, we better be there ourselves answering the call.
It's interesting, Eli Shveid has this very interesting, Eli Shveid, one of the most prominent Israeli teachers, students of the history of Jewish thought and Jewish thinkers who, for the most part, his career was totally uninterested in Heschel, and then writes a chapter about Heschel in a wonderful book of his called Nevi'im la'amam ve'la'enoshut, Prophets to Their People and to Humanity. And the premise, by the way, is fascinating, right? It's about all these 20th century Jewish thinkers who have this problem. On the one hand, the tradition definitively states that there are no more prophets. On the other hand, I think I might be one. Right? It's just a fascinating book. And he says, this very interesting thing, he says, Heschel may not have thought himself a prophet, but he thought himself Nevi HaNevi'im. His job was, the prophets saw themselves as communicating the will of God, and Heschel saw himself as communicating the will of the prophets. Right. Which is not a claim to prophecy, but it is a claim to, on some level, a divinely sent mission. There is a passage in God in Search of Man in the end of Book 1, which is really quite striking, which I haven't seen anyone pay attention to, actually, where he says, some of us have had moments where the illumination is so powerful that we realize we've been guided and how to guide, or something. I forget exactly the formulation.
You quote it in the book, right.
It's a very powerful moment of confession for him. Mm-hmm. I think maybe I should say, in light of what you said, that, I talked about his attack on Maimonides, but there's really another side to his relation to Maimonides that is really about this. So, and this is something that Michael Marmor from Hebrew Union College has written about really beautifully, that as a philosopher, Maimonides is a kind of anti-hero for Heschel. But as a person, in the kind of life Heschel thinks Maimonides led, which I'll explain in a moment, Maimonides is actually a hero and a role model. Heschel famously claims, and he claims this already from a very young age, that as Maimonides got older, the reason his literary output decreased is that he realized that what a Jewish thinker should be doing is spending more time with his patients. And I think it's not so crazy to suggest that on some level he's telegraphing the direction of his own life. That at a certain moment, he's revising his dissertation on the prophets, and on some level he's moved by the claim that, Amos HaNavi would not spend his whole life writing a book about Amos HaNavi.
And by 1962, his great stuff is out pretty much.
Right, exactly. So he decides to move into this moment of service. Now, I don't know whether this is a kind of can of worms I want to open up in this moment, but, the side of, at the end of the day, by temperament, Heschel was an activist.
Mm-hmm. Even in his prose.
Lahavdil, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to compare myself to him, but at the end of the day, by temperament, I'm a philosopher, which means that the chapter I didn't write in this book, there were 2 chapters in this book I could have written that I didn't write, and maybe in retrospect I ought to. One was about his understanding of the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, mm-hmm. for which he is often celebrated, but which I actually find to be some of the most unphilosophically thought through essays of his, and I felt I couldn't talk about that in less than 100 more pages. But also I didn't write about the theology of activism. And part of that was because I wasn't sure there was a fully developed theory there, and part of it was because I did not feel this was the book in which I wanted to take on the question of, at the end of the day, is the employment of prophetic rhetoric a good thing for our culture? On the one hand, when we look at moments when someone clearly did things that from hindsight we all think were totally right, like, yes, what a hero for using that language, but what if he had used that language for politics you find reprehensible? Now you could say it's okay to use prophetic rhetoric as long as you're right. And that's a position one can stake out. I mean, I'm not saying that flippantly, but I think there's a lot to think about there. And something that I talk about a lot that does not win friends for me in some of the places I hang out is I actually think it's very common for sort of liberal American Jews to say, oh yes, the Christian right, they think they know what God wants. Really? More so than the people on the Upper West Side? I'm not so sure. I think there's a lot of interesting things to think about there, and I have a lot of misgivings about this. I'm not sure that a world in which there's no daylight between my political convictions and Ritzon Hashem makes me very nervous.
Extremely. Extremely.
And so on the one hand, yes, he picked issues that I totally celebrate. I think he was enormously morally courageous. I'm not sure I love some of the rhetoric.
How can you tell your friends? He told his friends on the Vietnam War they weren't just wrong, they were evil, right? They were evil. They backed a war that was evil, right?
Yeah, there's a lot we could say about this.
There's a lot we could say about that.
I think my only point about this is that I think it's far messier than we are often willing to think about this issue.